Hi. Hi, it is Writing Wednesday, and I was attempting to do a horizontal format, but it seems to be past uh, my technological abilities, so we're back in vertical. I think I'll figure this out somehow. uh, anyway, it is Writing Wednesday, vertical or horizontal. It's still the same information. And this is today is going to be about genre. And what do we mean about genre? Classically, there is a bookstore will have literary fiction where people will go to read, you know, straightforward literary fiction, straightforward fiction. There's often a genre of contemporary fiction versus literary fiction. Who knows what that might be? Um, it's often genre is often seen as a bookseller's problem. You know, people write a book, and it's like, what kind of book is this? Is this a young adult? Is this literary fiction? Is this a crime novel? A spy novel? A romance novel? What kind of novel is it? And it's a bookseller's problem. Where do we put the books so that a reader can find them? Somebody who's looking for a certain type of novel. This is not a writer's problem. Writers will often first encounter this. Hi, Natasha. Writers will often uh, encounter this when they are first dealing with an agent. They will say, an agent will say, well, I see this as a young adult, or I see this as a mystery, or I see this as whatever. And then it gets unloaded in the writer's lap, and you have to decide, do you want this to be primarily geared to the young adult reader, the adult reader, who's it for? But I think that many writers do have a preference when they are working on their book, that they know very clearly the type of book they are creating, that they are creating a science fiction novel, they are creating a mystery, they are creating a thriller, a spy novel, they are writing for young adults. And I think each genre has its concerns that come forward, either while the writer is writing them or afterwards when the agent is scratching their head and going, now how am I going to market this? So it's a writing question and a marketing question. And as you know, I'm not very interested in marketing questions, not my thing. But I'm very interested in writing questions. And so I thought I'd talk about genre. I just finished writing a noir story for a publication. There's a series of city noirs. I wrote for Los Angeles Noir. I have a story that is actually going to be shot in January. The people are exercising their option to make the movie, and so they're going to make the movie of my Los Angeles Noir. But I just finished another noir for Palm Springs Noir, and they're in Akashic Books. If you've ever seen them, I'd say there's 20 of them from different cities. And I would say that the mystery genre, of which noir tends to border, or if not overlap, kind of the Venn diagram of noir would include mystery, would include thriller, suspense, as well as, literary fiction, depending on how you're pitching, how high you're pitching your sites. I think the main thing about noir, which is the reason I'm talking about it, is somebody had heard me talk about noir while I was writing it and said, You should talk a little bit more about that. So I'll start with genre. We'll start with noir as the only genre. I've written in young adult too, so I'll talk about that as well. But noir, I wish I could have somebody who is a real crime writer with me. I know several, and they're wonderful and very hardworking writers. The mystery writers are probably the hardest working writers, and I'm sure the romance writers who write like a book every 6 months. That's a work ethic, right? Mystery is usually a book a year. That is insane, but they do. Um, Genre, as far as noir, I always see noir as, especially Los Angeles noir. It's it's wonderful here because of the contrast between the sunny kind of bland exterior and the dark shadowy interior of noir, interior of the troubled characters. And my take on noir, which this is very personal, I just thought I'd talk about it, and you, I'm sure, have your own ideas about it, especially if you're writing in the field. Um, Noir is often about the past catching up to people, and in Los Angeles and in California is a perfect place for it because it's a place where people come to get away from the mistakes and the dark past wherever they came from. They're going to come here, and it's the opportunity and the sunshine, and they're going to be a different person now. Um, the underlying idea of noir is that you cannot start over. It's very cynical and pessimistic philosophy behind noir, which is that you cannot start over. The past will always catch up to you. You cannot start anew. It's sort of it's anti-Californian in many ways, because we have this ideal that you can come away and start your life anew and step away from the past and be a new person. And noir knocks on the door and says, no, the past catches up to you. And it's Faulknerian, the past is never past. It stays with you, it comes along. It will eventually knock on your door. So classic noir is everything is groovy, somebody has made it big, and then the past knocks on their door. Something that I was dealing with in noir was noir is about people who are who make bad choices, people whose moral structure isn't that good, who have fudged in some way or failed to rise to, the actual moral imperative of adulthood in some way. Could be a criminal past they're covering over or petty crime that they're involved in. The story I just wrote for Palm Springs Noir, The Desert is so rife for noir because the sunny, good-looking surface, tremendous corruption goes on as well. So I loved that. But I have a character who this is a revenge story. And the thing about revenge is you're automatically in the noir zone of you can't win, you cannot win in the noir universe. And the weakness of this character is that there is something in the past that she has not been able to get over. She clings to it. And it has ruined her life. She has dedicated her life to a wrong that had been done her and has not ever gotten on with her life. And in the story, she has an opportunity. By accident, she runs across the person who has ruined her life. And, I could have her get her revenge and get away with it, but that's more of a fairy tale. It's not noir. Noir is that you pay for your sins. You pay for the fact that she paid for the fact that she could not get on with her life. She would not. She held on to the offense done to her, uh, as my husband would say, like a winning lottery ticket. She would not let it go. She allowed it to define her life. Therefore, when she, as God in this universe, when she um, has her revenge, that she cannot emerge the winner in a noir universe, because there is justice in a noir universe. It's a dark justice, and I don't think that somebody who has nursed a grudge for all those years, and sought revenge and received their revenge walks away from that. I have that in White Olander as well. I just don't believe it. I believe that something happens to a person who decides that they are going to wreak revenge on somebody who has ruined their life. I don't think it's you walk away from that on a kind of a cosmic level. So noir is often the past catching up to you, and then also I love the losers. Noir people never do things right. It's one of the wonderful things about noir. If they decide to pull off a bank robbery, they're just going to get themselves in worse trouble. They automatically. One of the tropes of the genre is the detective story, where there is a hero or heroic figure of some sort, and often a bloodied and scarred character, somebody who's lived in the noir universe a long time, but carries an essential moral compass. That's like Philip Marlowe in Raymond Chandler's books. His detective is sort of a beaten and bloodied knight in rusty armor, and knows the difference between good and bad, and knows the compromises that people make, and knows how the past comes back, and yet does not compromise his essential moral compass to that. So there's a great deal of wonderful writing in Chandler that's about the irony of living in that being a basically uncorrupted person living in a corrupt world. So it has much to say to us, the detective novel. Why is this different from non-genre writing? In general, I would say the difference between genre writing, spy, thriller, mystery, sci-fi, romance, and literary fiction is it's not a hard and fast line. It has more to do with the complexity and depth with which the situation is treated. You look at Graham Greene novels, these can be called thrillers, but it's definitely because the questions being asked are large. It's not just who done it, but the social context in which it was done, and the deeper, like, what does it mean that this is being done? John le Carré is seen as a genre writer. He writes in the spy thriller genre, like that's where it would be in the bookstore. But he always asks the bigger questions, and his characters are not interchangeable. His characters are very specific, and they have real weight and substance and dimensionality. So a person who just wants to read a thriller loves those books, because they do all the things that the thriller does. They keep your page turning. They create a world. There's no one thing about genre fiction is that the world building is really, really, really important. the where we are, when we are, the world of the character, science fiction. The world building is fantasy, hugely important. So we'll talk about those in a minute. But sense of place that you get in mystery genre, spy thrillers. Uh, they use like all every genre uses all the tools of fiction writing that we've talked about, and there is a really wide range of ambition in these books, from somebody who's just trying to get a product out on the market, and you know how I feel about that. um, I feel that if somebody is giving you their money, their time and attention, you owe it to them to do the best you can do and not just get something on the market. That works for the writer and for the publisher, but that doesn't really work as well for the reader as a writer who tries to do something, to the best of his or her ability, something beautiful, something meaningful, something lasting. The difference between the bag of Doritos and a good, home cooked meal, even if it's a genre type of meal, maybe it is, this is barbecue or this is a hamburger or whatever, but there's a difference between a fabulous burger and really good barbecue and just something with sauce dumped on it. And so, as fiction writers, in any genre, we want to work to the best of our ability, to use all the tools that I've been talking about on Writing Wednesdays. But they have also specific needs and specific requirements. So, mystery and thriller, the people who read mystery and thriller read for escape. They read for the intensity of the action. They read for a complete world and, something super at stake. They want to be turning those pages going, what's happening next? What's happening next? So they're going to be less patient than the reader of literary fiction who wants to, is more willing to linger and think about what's being presented. The mystery thriller suspense reader is going to be going like, get on with it. So realize that if that's your reader, that you're dealing with a fish that can't be played out too far. You've got to keep them on the hook, keep them on a pretty tight line. You don't want to spin out into some lyrical digression if you're writing for that audience. I think that, but as far as the world, the reality of the world, I remember talking to people at UC Riverside, the low residency MFA program. And many of the people who talked to me were writing in genre. They were a lot of science fiction and a lot of fantasy writers. And the thing to know about those genres is the more that you can answer larger questions about reality and as we're living it, as all humans live it, whether they're in a made-up world or in this world, the more that basic human questions are confronted, the richer the experience of that book will be. It's the difference between great science fiction, great fantasy, and potboilers. All of these genres have a kind of a low entry threshold that you can sell stuff that isn't that good because there's such a demand for more and more, because they read quickly. Many of them, the speed and the urgency are an essential part of those books. So there's a need for a lot of books. People read them very fast and often just read a tremendous number of them. But if they recognize themselves, if they recognize like pieces of their world in those science fiction worlds, inside those fantasy worlds, then it becomes much more dimensional and will be more lasting, be a more important book. And it's like archery. What do they? They teach you to shoot high, because if you shoot high, you're going to hit something. If you shoot low, you're just going to hit the ground. So even in writing, a fun genre, thriller, try to write up. Try not necessarily vocabulary, but try to write up in terms of the uniqueness of character, where instead of a stick character going through this story, have a little bit more of a unique character. Spend a little more time there thinking of, not like how their brother was blown away, like that, that kind of TV stuff of why they have to have the revenge, and they killed my kid and blah, 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 but actual personalities of that person. They are what they think about, what they worry about, what they, were they a good student in high school? Do they believe in God? Really, spend a little more time with those characters. I think that anytime somebody thinks about the nature of reality and makes a statement about it in any genre, it makes it just elevates the whole project. I just finished a kind of suspense thriller set in LA as an aftermath of the riots, called Your House Will Pay by Steph Cha. And she is a thriller writer, a crime writer, but it's very much about the characters. So it reads like a mystery, like a suspensier, but we get so much more insight into our world and the complexity of characters, who are not heroes or villains. They are somewhere in between. So it makes the reader have to think a little bit harder about these things. It's much more interesting. If you read Philip K. Dick, my favorite science fiction writer, he's dealing with issues that he's writing science fiction as a way of talking about what is going on in our world. It's not just, what if people were butterflies, or something like that, but actually, reaching in to say something. That's the best kind of genre fiction. It's where they start approaching the line, where what's the difference between the genre and literature as a whole? It becomes very fluid when you're writing very well. I think the intention of a thriller is the first and foremost is keeping the line taut, making sure that the reader can't swim away, that there's a suspense there, a great suspense and urgency. It's like the number one thing. In sci-fi and fantasy, the first concern, I believe, is probably world building, of bringing people into a world they don't know and creating it believably. And oddly enough, I think the stranger the world that you're creating is, the more important the senses, the basic building blocks of real reality need to be fulfilled. That we need to be physically in the bodies of the characters. Hot, cold, all those primitive things that make things real. The landscape has to be real. We have to hear sounds far away and close up. All of that sense observation that we've been talking about. That is going to be the most important thing in making your far out world believable, because you don't want the reader to sit back and look at it as a construct, like a little puppet theater. They want to you want them to believe it's real and this is really what's happening. So you have to work harder than most to create a world and make sure that it's real reality. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is that suit heavy? Are you sweating in it? You know, the fantasy world has to be very, very consistent. I think that bad fantasy is where the reader, it's like one of those movies where you think the actors are having more fun than you are. You know, fantasy, if it's not really well done, tends to feel like the fun was all the author's fun in writing it, without really creating anything believable, urgent, tangible, that the reader enters into. Horror, you know, obviously the first thing is that it's creating a world in which horrible things can happen, are happening. How can we just, you know, what are people afraid of, you know, and how do you make that concrete? I think part of horror is horror posits a closed universe. You know, you cannot get away from this. This is pervasive to the structure of reality. There's a bleed through into something that is irrational and uncontrollable. So I think the different genres have world views that are attached to them. Spy, I recently read a spy book. I love spy novel, that genre. And, you know, having grown up with James Bond and John le Carré, just crazy about spy books. And I read one recently that was very literary. But this one took too much time in setting up the job, the mission. So we had a wonderful sense of who everybody was and why they were doing what they were doing. It was glorious. But the setup, I'd say, was 60% of the book, and the mission was like 20% of the book, or maybe 70-30. It was not properly paced. The proportions were off. You know, if you're going to be writing a spy story, remember that the mission is the central part of the thing. So it's a matter of proportion. You know, if you're spending too much time developing everybody, all the characters, and why they are who they are and what their relationship is, and then the mission goes like this, people are like, well, why did I read that? That did not fulfill the function and the narrative. The narrative weight was not right. So it was a huge build up to nothing. You know, you have to be careful about what you're building up to and make sure that your mission itself is the thing, and pays off. So you can keep the suspense line tight, but if the denouement just happens too easily, it's a mess. And the same thing, I remember reading a book called The Samilla's Sense of Snow, which was set up to be a psychological thriller, but like 2/3 of the way through it, it went from being a psychological thriller, very realistic psychological thriller, to being kind of an actioner and a lot of running around and stuff. And it's like it did all that setup, and then it went off the rails and became this just running around actioner where there needs to be we talked about story. There needs to be a correspondence between the setup and the payoff. And in these cases, there's a disjunct. Um, so what other genres are there? Young adult. I've written a young adult novel, Kicks. It was very long ago, my first book. I don't think very many people read it. And I'm often asked about young adult because people are writing a lot of young adult right now. I think the young adult reader is very active. They're at the most active reader phase in their lives, probably. They have more time to read and they're more into it. They don't have a lot of things pulling them in other directions. And what's the difference between a literary novel and a literary young adult novel? And I think the essence of that is that a young adult, first of all, I think that the moral sight lines of young adult fiction need to be pretty clear. That adult fiction should present the reader with difficult moral situations, very murky, so that the adult has to navigate, how do I really feel about this? You know, who's right, who's wrong? What would I do in that situation? Whereas young adult literature tends to be where there are clearer choices, more understandable choices. The stories aren't as complex, and generally they're not about adults. That, you know, young readers want to see themselves in the story. You know, a story about a marriage of people in their 40s isn't going to interest somebody who's 15. Maybe they will, but then that would be reading adult fiction. When we talk about genre, you know, let's talk about poetry. Now, this is sort of the golden age of poetry right now. And I think it's because of young adult writing. So many young adult novels are written in verse right now, so that it's leaving. It's leaving. Okay, sorry. It's opening up the possibility that poetry isn't the thing it was for people in my generation, the terrifying thing that your teacher rolls out for you, and then you have to find the hidden meaning in everything and the symbols, and, you know, people just would run screaming for the exits if they, you know, it was sort of a disservice to poetry. Whereas now there isn't the fear of poetry anymore, because writers like Ellen Hopkins, Crank, Glass, I mean, she's written wonderful books, novels set in verse. There's a lot of young adult fiction written in verse. So the right now it's the separation between poetry and fiction and memoir. There's a lot of crossover going on in all the genres. Mixture of high and low, mixture of media. People, you know, the Jennifer Egan book Goon Squad has, you know, emails and texts and all kinds of electronic media represented. People don't, you know, that's our world. We live in a mixed media world. There's a lot of, our culture is a sampling culture. It's we're not as worried about keeping everything separate, like a TV dinner, you know, with the chicken in this part and the mashed potatoes in this part, the dessert over here, or the peas. You know, we're much more willing to cross genre. To It's not a big deal for people to write a memoir, like an autobiographical novel. I just read Ocean Vuong's On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous. He just won his MacArthur today. And this is a novel that is heavily memoiristic, heavily autobiographical. Do we care? No, I don't care. I mean, the bookstore might have had trouble shelving it, going, do we want to put this as a memoir, or do we want this as a novel? But he and his, I'm sure this was not a bookseller or a publisher decision. This guy is really on top of it, and I'm sure he decided that this is a novel for various reasons. I can accept that. I don't really care if it's a novel or a memoir. It was just so beautiful. So there's a blurring between memoir and fiction. There is I use a lot of poetry in my books. I had originally started Marina M. as a novel in verse. I feel like I might do that again someday. It's the mixing of genres is fantastic right now. I think that there's so many times where horror is very close to us in mainstream fiction. Thriller, crime, spy is starting to come up in literary fiction. I think it's a weighting of how fast, how taut that suspense line is going to be, what the author is going to put at the top of the list, and make sure that is the most dominant. I'm writing a science fiction story right now, and for me, it's space is a place, and so all of the world building, all of the creation of a believable space with believable rules that are going to be internally consistent is hugely important, and extrapolating from our world, which is what science fiction does best. It allows us to see our world from a remove. Then fantasy, people have fantasy is incredibly entertaining, and in a world where we feel really helpless, like nothing can be done and nobody has any power and the bad guys always win and stuff, the idea of fantasy and having dragons, just burn that guy's ass, I mean, it's very satisfying. But I think that fantasy that just stays on the level of action is not as rewarding as fantasy which also, deals with human longing, and looks at things like power, and looks at things like helplessness, and looks at things like how people live in the world. One thing I would like to say about all of these genres that I've taught for many years, that I noticed to my horror, are people who are writing in a genre and have not bothered to read widely in their genre. Talking to people who are writing fantasy who've never read The Sword and the Stone, the real one, by White, or The Once and Future King, who haven't read Dick, the sci-fi writers haven't read Heinlein and Dick and, Stanislaw Lem and all those guys. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe it's not going to, maybe Asimov doesn't sing to you if you're writing sci-fi alternative universe, kind of Philip Jose Farmer, Philip K. Dick kind of stuff. But if you're going to be writing sci-fi, read widely. If you're going to be writing fantasy, read widely. Thriller, read widely. People writing thriller, detective, crime, and they haven't read the classics. They've never read Highsmith, or they've never read, James M. Cain, or whoever, Hammett. You have to create a little education for yourself. People don't study, especially genre. People don't study genre in college. Maybe they do now, but they certainly didn't back in the day. And who am I to talk? I was a Russian major, history major. Create a little course for yourself. Look at the outlines of your field. What has been, what have you read in translation? What is being done? What has already been done? See if you can inspire yourself to reach a little further. Do you think genres tend to follow certain formulas to sell? Yes, I think that is a commerce thing that goes on, is writers treating their work like hamburger, and publishers treating it like hamburger, and readers, consuming it like hamburger. I don't like that model. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Ambiguous endings, slower paced plots are not popular. Yes, because of, especially in a suspense genre, you have to keep that fishing line tight. And that is an absolute requirement, whether you're Graham Greene or, the latest, the latest slasher. The suspense has to be there. Stephen King. The suspense is important. So ambiguous endings, maybe, but slower pace is not happy. That's not a good thing. Happy endings, people like a happy ending, but they don't really care. It's like watch Chinatown. People did not complain about the ending. That was Chinatown. That's noir at its most noirish. It doesn't turn out well. What happens when you read widely in a genre you want to write and you find that every idea you've ever had has already been done? Every story has already been written. Every story has been written. It's what do you have to add to it? What do you have to say? So every story has never been written, because there's always your story. You're going to be different because you are different. So your take on that classic, will be incredibly different. So use your reading of the best to inspire you rather than depress you. Look for the things that make you want to throw the book down and start working. But to be a crime writer and never to have read classic crime fiction, to be a horror writer and never to have read classic horror, there will be a shallowness about that work because they just don't know. You can be very satisfied with very little. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to talk about so there's the formulaic genre fiction, which, because of the incredible appetite that the genre fiction reader has for new material, you can actually sell junk. But this is not about writing junk, because I don't think anybody needs to write junk. If you need a job, get a job. That I take literature, the production of writing, as an art form, and it's my calling, and it's my crusade, and it's the thing I really care about. So I don't care about the production of mediocre junk. Yes, there's a lot of it, and especially in the genres, but there's a lot of really, really, really fine writing in the genres. And We haven't talked about romance. Okay, romance. The romance genre is a tremendous machine. Wow. You know, you talk about a factory. These are people writing a new book every 2 months. Bam, bam, bam. 6 books a year. So great work ethic, you know. And I have a high esteem for people who just work really hard. But I don't want to read any of that. I don't want to read it. But there is romantic literature that has lasted for hundreds of years, because what is romance? What is a romantic novel? I used to work for American Film Magazine, and there was the 50th anniversary of Wuthering Heights. That was a Goldwyn film, and I talked to Samuel Goldwyn Jr., or was it the third? Anyway, the son or grandson, about Wuthering Heights and about romance. And I was like, well, you know, if you, what is it that makes a romantic novel work, a romance story? And he said, in romance, the important thing is what keeps the characters apart. So it's not how much they love each other or how hot they are for each other. It's the forces against them that you put your eye on when you're writing that. And I thought that was like a super bit of advice. So if you're out there writing romantic fiction, what keeps them apart? So we've talked about young adult, we've talked about poetry. That's a true, you know, that's a true genre, but in fiction we certainly use poetics. And there are certainly book-length poems, novels in verse, very famous ones. Eugene Onegin by Pushkin. There's a wonderful book called Omeros by, I think it's Komonyaka. That is the Odyssey, the Iliad story set in the Caribbean in verse. It is beautiful, beautiful beyond belief. Golden Gate by Seth Vikram. There's a wonderful book, a werewolf book, so it's horror and verse, called White Teeth by Toby Barlow. That was really good. I like novels in verse. I think that mixing genre on the page, like sampling, is extremely modern. We live in a very fragmented society, and so the fact that these narratives are fragmented in different forms makes perfect sense. Forms and voices. Amber Tamblin's novel Any Man is you know, full of voices and forms. There's, you know, there's verse, there's emails, there's transcripts, there's monologue, I mean, just a tremendous assortment of forms. So I think don't worry about the forms. Use them. It's very, you know, I mean, the modern world really has broken open magical realism. Isn't that interesting? I don't usually think of it as a form. I don't think of it as a genre, but of course people do think it's a genre. It's a way of handling a narrative where certain things can happen that don't happen in the real world. That's more of a mythopoetic world in which, you know, the girl becomes a butterfly. But it's not fantasy in the sense that the bulk of the story is set in the absolute real world, where these strange things from time to time occur. Whereas a book like, you know, Harry Potter, the whole point of the thing is living in a magical universe. So you wouldn't call that magical realism. You would call that fantasy. The title is Omeros, like Homer. Omeros. That is a beautiful book. What else can I answer here? So writing in genre is a very interesting thing to do. It's fun for me after writing historical fiction. There's a genre, historical fiction. It's just, that's a bookshelf, historical fiction. Just, do they put it on a shelf at the bookstore because some people want to see their history. They want to see their history enlivened by the actual characters running around. But it's also literature. And the historical fiction reader is a very patient one. So unlike the thriller reader, the historical fiction reader will take a fair amount of digression, will take a little bit more exposition, but you have to be careful not to even historical fiction is not a textbook. It has to be lived, and information about the world has to come through situation rather than setting it up, just like telling us, especially in dialogue about, what just happened with the Queen is a really, really, really poor way to transmit information. So historical fiction, that genre, you have to be very careful about how you bring the reader up to speed on what's going on and not overburdening them with information they don't need to understand that scene, but how to deliver the information they do need to understand the world that you've put them in. Dystopian literature is usually a branch of science fiction or alternative universe. It's a worldview, a depiction of a ruined world that people are living in, often not too far in the future or fairly far in the future, extrapolating from the things that we see in this world. And it has definitely a pessimistic viewpoint of our current existence. Yeah. Okay, Dickens, somebody's reading Great Expectations, looking for a beautiful language. Dickens is not necessarily a language guy. He is very interested in society and depicting a complex society, and especially its victims. He has a sense of humor, but he writes about people who are not in funny situations. He's not a beautiful sentence guy. He's a writer of powerful narratives, and his pictures of society are incredibly moving and have changed the world. So not every author does it all. So thank you very much for watching my Writing Wednesday. I'm starting to upload these videos onto YouTube, mainly because not everybody is a big Facebook fan. And so if you want to look for old videos that you want to listen to again or see for the first time, they're on my YouTube channel, Janet Fitch's Writing Wednesday. So thank you, and hope to see you next week. Okay, bye.